When I bought the place by the lake, I wasn't looking for excitement. After 40 years in construction, I'd had my fill of noise, deadlines, and people arguing about things that didn't matter. What I wanted was silence, the kind you can hear. Mornings where the only decisions to make were between fishing or mowing, between coffee on the porch or coffee on the dock. You spend decades building things for other people, and then one day you realize you just want to sit and enjoy something that's already standing. That was my dream. Peace. Nothing more complicated than that. The first week after I moved in, I started fixing things. Not because they were broken, just because I can't help it. The dock was leaning like it had given up on life. A few new planks, a little sanding, and it looked sturdy enough to park a truck on. I trimmed the overgrown reeds around the lake so I could actually see the water sparkle again. The smell of cut grass mixed with the scent of damp wood and coffee. And for a man who's lived most of his life by the sound of circular saws, that was as close to heaven as it gets. The neighborhood seemed quiet, too. Families walking dogs in the evening, kids chasing each other with Nerf guns, the rhythmic hiss of sprinklers down the cul-de-sac. Everyone waved. I thought, this is the kind of place my wife would have loved. She used to tell me, "Tom, you need to learn how to sit still." Well, here I was doing my best impression of stillness, though I admit my version included a hammer in one hand and a level in the other. It didn't take long before I noticed the flyers. They came tucked neatly under my doormat and mailbox flag. Little reminders with cheerful fonts about community harmony, approved paint colors, and something called aesthetic uniformity. First, I laughed. Every neighborhood's got that one person who thinks they're running a kingdom out of their living room. I figured it was harmless. A welcome wagon kind of thing. My neighbors, Gary and Linda, had warned me there was an HOA, but they said it like you'd mention mosquitoes. Annoying, but part of the scenery. "Don't worry," Gary had said. "As long as you don't put a pink flamingo on the lawn, they leave you alone." So, naturally, I didn't expect trouble over the lake. It wasn't new. It wasn't man-made. It was on every county map going back 40 years. The ducks had seniority. But apparently, all it takes to summon chaos in suburbia is a retired guy with a weed trimmer and too much free time. Started the morning I found the letter. I just poured my second cup of coffee, the one you sip slower because the first burned your tongue, when I saw an envelope taped to my mailbox. It was printed on thick, glossy paper, HOA stationery, gold seal, the whole works. The kind of letter that thinks it's more important than it really is. The heading read, "Notice of Violation, Unauthorized Water Feature." I remember blinking at it, thinking maybe my neighbor's kid was pulling a prank. Then I read it again, slower this time. According to the letter, I was in violation of Section 4, Subsection B, Artificial Landscape Modifications. It stated, in bureaucratic poetry, that I had constructed or significantly altered a water feature without prior approval. The penalty, a $500 fine and a mandatory restoration, order to return the property to original visual conformity. I had to read that last part twice because it sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. I was being fined for having a lake. I looked out at the water, which was calmly reflecting the morning sky, as if to say, "Don't look at me. I've been here the whole time." I laughed. An actual, full laugh that startled the heron sitting on my dock. Then I folded the letter, walked back inside, and set it next to my coffee maker. Some people collect postcards from places they've been. I decided to start collecting absurdities from places I live. That afternoon, I called the number at the bottom of the letter. A woman with the kind of cheerful voice you usually hear at customer service desks picked up. "Homeowners Association office. This is Dana speaking," she chirped. I explained who I was, what property I owned, and that I'd received a rather creative accusation. "Ah, yes," she said. "Your property shows an unapproved water feature on satellite imagery." I told her the lake wasn't new. She said, typing. "Our records indicate no such body of water existed before your ownership." I told her I could show her 40 years of ducks that would disagree. Silence. Then she said, "You can file an appeal, but fines will accrue until the matter is resolved." And that was that. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a good 10 seconds, The way you do when you're trying to figure out if the world's gotten dumber or you've just finally noticed. I went out to the lake, sat on the edge of the dock, and let my feet dangle in the water. The surface rippled, reflecting the sun, peaceful as ever. Somewhere across the lake, a lawnmower started up, and I thought, this must be what irony sounds like. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things. People driving by slower than usual. A man I didn't recognize standing across the street, snapping photos with his phone. Then Gary came over. He was carrying the community newsletter, folded in half. "Tom," he said, half laughing, half whispering, "you made the front page." The headline read, "Unauthorized construction near wetland area." Underneath was a blurry photo of my dock. The caption, "Homeowner potentially endangering ecosystem integrity." Gary smirked. "They're acting like you built the Hoover Dam." We both laughed, but it didn't feel as funny when I checked my mailbox later and found another envelope. Same gold seal, new fine total, $1,000. The letter said the HOA had re-inspected and found non-compliance ongoing. I hadn't done anything but drink coffee and watch ducks. Apparently, that counted as resistance. The absurdity of it all started to sink in. I wasn't angry yet, just confused. I mean, how do you reason with people who don't believe in water? I decided to stay calm. My wife always said my temper was like propane, quiet until it explodes. So I kept it bottled up. I told myself it's a misunderstanding. I'll explain it in person at the next meeting. A few mornings later, while I was tightening the bolts on the dock ladder, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I turned around and saw a man in cargo shorts, polo shirt, and a badge clipped to his belt like he was auditioning for a show called CSI Suburbia. "Morning," I said. He introduced himself as Bob, HOA compliance officer. Turns out he was also Mrs. Greaves's husband. She was the HOA president, a woman I'd met once at the community barbecue where she complained about the color of the napkins. Bob started pacing near the lake with a clipboard and measuring tape. "We need to verify the dimensions of this feature," he said, "for our records." I told him it was a lake. He said, "We'll determine that." Then, as if fate wanted to prove a point, he leaned too far over the edge and fell straight into the mud. Splash, sputter, silence. I offered him a hand. He declined and waddled off like a wet cat. The next morning, my fine doubled again. That was when disbelief turned into something else. A quiet, simmering curiosity about how far people would go just to feel in charge. I didn't want to fight, but I could tell one was brewing. The lake sat there, unbothered, watching the neighborhood unravel over its existence. There's a strange comedy in that, grown adults arguing with geography. That night, I sat back on the porch, listening to the crickets and the faint hum of streetlights. I looked at that stack of letters on my kitchen table through the window, each one thicker and more official looking than the last. I thought about all the things I'd built in my life, all the problems I'd solved with a hammer or a blueprint. This one, though, was different. You can't fix stupid with a wrench. Still, part of me knew I wasn't going to let this go. I didn't know how yet, but I was done playing along with nonsense. I took one last sip of coffee, folded the latest notice, and said out loud to no one in particular, "That letter changed everything." The morning after that last letter, I woke up to the sound of a camera shutter. Not birds, not sprinklers, someone taking pictures. I peeked through the blinds and saw a man crouched near the ditch across the street, holding what looked like a telephoto lens you'd expect from a wildlife photographer. Only thing wild around here was my patience wearing thin. He wore a polo shirt with HOA compliance team, embroidered on the chest, like he was part of some suburban SWAT unit. I stepped outside in my robe and waved. He froze, then awkwardly waved back, pretending to take a picture of a mailbox. It was 7:14 a.m. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee, and apparently I was already the morning entertainment. By 10 o'clock, another letter arrived. Same gold seal, new bold headline, "Failure to comply." The fine had grown to $1,500. They'd added a line about imminent legal referral and something about community safety. I called the number again. Dana answered, same cheery voice, same hollow politeness. I told her I hadn't built anything, hadn't changed anything, and that I'd be happy to show them the deed proving the lake had been there for decades. She paused, clearly scrolling through something on her screen, and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but the HOA doesn't recognize your document as valid without board review." I asked her what qualified as valid in their world. Hand-painted map by the president? She said, "Please refrain from sarcasm." I said, "Please refrain from charging me rent for water." That phone call summed up everything wrong with bureaucracy. Plenty of authority, not much sense. The next day, the HOA Facebook page lit up. Someone had posted a photo of my backyard, clearly taken by my early morning paparazzo, with the caption, "Community concern, possible wetland violation." The comments section was a masterpiece of suburban paranoia. Could attract mosquitoes. Dangerous for kids. Probably lowers property values. Someone even wrote, "Looks man-made." I couldn't resist replying once. Nature tends to make its own stuff. Within 5 minutes, my comment disappeared. I wasn't surprised. Power, no matter how small, loves an echo chamber. Then there was Mrs. Greaves. If you've never met a woman who runs an HOA, imagine a hall monitor who never got over her moment of authority in 8th grade. She was the type to carry a clipboard to a cookout. She stopped me one afternoon while I was clearing brush near the dock. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone all sugar and threat. "I hope you're taking this seriously. The community voted years ago to prohibit artificial water features." I told her, as politely as possible, that the lake wasn't artificial unless God had started contracting under my name. Her lips pursed so tightly I swear you could have used them as a gasket. "We'll be watching this closely," she said, and marched off like a general whose army consisted entirely of neighborhood gossips. 2 days later, I caught sight of her husband, Bob, the one who'd done an unplanned dive into the mud, standing on my property line again, this time holding a drone controller. I heard a faint buzzing and looked up to see a small drone hovering over the lake, spinning like a mechanical mosquito. I couldn't help but laugh. They'd upgraded surveillance from clipboards to air support. I stood there sipping coffee, waving at it, half hoping it would fall in the water just for poetic balance. That night, I got another letter. Photographic evidence of continued noncompliance. Fines will continue to accrue. It was signed by Mrs. Greaves personally. I tacked it to the fridge next to a picture of my grandkids. At this point, it was starting to feel like a collection. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so exhausting. Every day felt like a new episode of HOA. The Reckoning. My neighbors started noticing, too. Gary came over carrying 2 beers and said, "Heard you've got a drone problem." I nodded. "Guess they think I'm hiding Atlantis." He grinned. "Buddy, around here, you either get fined or you're not trying hard enough." Even Linda, who usually avoided confrontation like it was contagious, whispered, "They fined me last year because my Christmas lights were too twinkly." I asked, "Too twinkly?" She nodded. Apparently, they distracted traffic. We both laughed until tears came out. There's something liberating about realizing you're not the only one stuck in a sitcom. Then came the newsletter. Every HOA sends one, a monthly sermon disguised as community updates. The front page headline, "Preserving Harmony. Why Rules Matter." The subtext, "Because we said so." Halfway through the article, my situation made a cameo. Recently, a homeowner has engaged in unapproved landscape modifications, resulting in potential safety hazards. That was me. Right below, there was a photo of the lake. My lake, cropped just enough to make it look like a muddy pit. I guess context wasn't in their budget. That evening, while walking my dog, I overheard 2 neighbors talking near the corner mailbox. "Did you hear? He dug that lake himself." "Really? With what? A spoon?" "They said he's defying the HOA." The way they said defying made it sound like I was planning a coup. I didn't bother correcting them. Let them have their mystery. The next escalation came faster than I expected. One afternoon, I noticed tire tracks on my driveway. A white SUV with an HOA logo was parked near the edge of my property. Out stepped 2 men in matching polos, one holding a measuring wheel, the other carrying a clipboard. I walked out and asked, "You boys lose something?" The older one said, "Routine inspection." I said, "Routine for who, exactly?" He muttered something about verifying shoreline alterations. They walked straight past my mailbox, onto my property, without asking permission. I followed, hands in my pockets, watching as they snapped photos of cattails like they just discovered a new species. One of them pointed at a patch of sand near the dock and whispered, "Evidence of dredging." I told him, "That's where my dog rolls after swimming." He scribbled something down anyway. That evening, I got the inevitable email. Inspection conducted. Violations confirmed. I laughed so hard I almost spilled my dinner. My dog just looked at me, tail wagging, as if to say, "Told you I shouldn't have rolled in the sand." Despite the irritation, I tried to keep a sense of humor about it. You have to. Otherwise, you start to feel like you're living in a parody of yourself. I started narrating the events in my head like an old documentary. Day 23. The local HOA continues its surveillance campaign. The native homeowner remains unbothered, though increasingly caffeinated. That helped me stay sane. Still, there were moments when it wore me down. The fines had stacked up to nearly $3,000. Imaginary debt for an imaginary crime. The letters got more aggressive, full of legal phrases like escalatory measures and further action pending. They wanted submission, not conversation. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. If they were going to talk about me, I might as well give them a face to attach to the legend. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a beige box of a building with folding chairs and stale coffee that tasted like regret. About 20 people showed up, most of them there for the gossip. At the front sat Mrs. Greaves with her binder, gavel, and a look that said she'd been preparing for this moment since birth. When they got to community violations, she cleared her throat. "We have a continuing issue regarding Property 42B, an unapproved lake alteration." I raised my hand. "It's not an alteration, it's called geography." A few people chuckled. She didn't. "Mr. Hayes," she said sharply, "this meeting is for rule compliance, not debate." I replied, "Hard to comply with rules that don't apply." Her face tightened like wet cement setting in the sun. After a few more tense exchanges, she adjourned the meeting early for decorum. I left to polite applause from the back row, mostly Gary. The next morning, I got another fine notice and a new addition. Failure to demonstrate respect for HOA leadership during public session. I had to hand it to them. Creativity wasn't their problem. By then, disbelief had turned to something sharper. I wasn't just being harassed. I was being tested. And I'm not the kind of man who fails a test I didn't ask to take. That night, I sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight, listening to the crickets buzz. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of calm that comes right before you decide enough is enough. I took a sip of my beer and thought, all right, you want to fight? Let's make it fair. Because if there's one thing I learned in 40 years of construction, it's this: measure twice, cut once, and always check the foundation before you start tearing things down. The HOA had no idea they were about to find out what that really meant. It was about a week after that meeting when I decided to stop reacting and start thinking. I sat at my kitchen table early one morning, the kind of morning where the mist still clings to the lake and everything smells like wet cedar and coffee. I spread every HOA letter across the table like a deck of bad poker hands. They were all the same, bold fonts, legal-sounding nonsense, and empty threats. I took a deep breath, looked at the pile, and said out loud, "All right, let's play by your rules, only better." It's funny how calm can look like surrender from the outside. Mrs. Greaves probably thought I'd finally given up, but I was doing what I'd always done best: reading the blueprints before swinging the hammer. Construction teaches you that you don't win by force, you win by precision. Bureaucracy's just another building, and I was about to find its weak beam. I started with the basics. I dug out my closing documents, the property survey, and a dusty old binder the previous owner had left in the attic marked Deeds and Boundaries. The thing smelled like an old library book. Inside were yellowed maps dating back to the 1970s showing the lake, clear as day, right there on my lot. Not behind it, not beside it, but directly inside my boundary line. I laughed quietly, imagining the look on their faces when I showed them. Still, I wanted confirmation. Old maps are nice, but paperwork with stamps shuts people up. So I went to the county assessor's office. Small building, flickering lights, the kind of place where time moves slower because the printer's always jammed. I asked the clerk for the most recent parcel map of my property. She typed my address into her computer, squinted at the screen, and then looked up at me. "You own a lake?" she asked. I nodded. "Apparently," I said. "But my HOA doesn't believe in water." She laughed. One of those knowing laughs that said she'd seen this kind of nonsense before. A few minutes later, she handed me a large printed map stamped and sealed, showing my lot boundaries extending well beyond what anyone in the HOA realized. I noticed something interesting right away. According to the official record, not only did I own the lake, it looked like the HOA clubhouse and their so-called community dock were sitting a few feet inside my parcel. I double-checked the scale. Nope, not a mistake. They'd built their pride and joy on land that wasn't even theirs. My coffee went cold as I stared at that map. The situation had just changed categories, from annoying to hilarious. Driving home, I couldn't stop grinning. I kept the papers on the passenger seat like a prized catch. When I got back, I made a copy of everything and put the originals in a safe. I'd learned over the years that once you have proof, patience becomes a weapon. That afternoon, I trimmed some overgrowth near the lake, making the property lines more visible. I hammered in a few small stakes and tied bright red survey tape to each one. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make people curious. By evening, I'd posted a simple wooden sign on the path that led to the HOA's private dock. It read, "Private property, access by permission only." No threats, no sarcasm, just facts. The next morning, I heard the inevitable knock. I opened the door to find Mrs. Greaves herself, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice quivering between politeness and panic. "You're not authorized to post signage on community land." I smiled. "That's the thing, Mrs. Greaves. It's not community land. It's mine." I handed her a copy of the county map. She stared at it for a long moment, her face doing arithmetic it didn't like. "That can't be right," she muttered. "We've maintained that area for years." I shrugged. "Then I guess you've been trespassing for years." She left without another word. I watched her speedwalk back to her SUV and drive off, probably straight to an emergency meeting. By lunch, an email hit my inbox titled urgent. Unauthorized claim to HOA property. The board was reviewing my documents. Translation: panic in progress. I spent the next few days waiting, quietly enjoying the unfolding chaos. Neighbors started whispering. Gary came by with his usual beer and grin. "You really did it, didn't you?" he said. "They're in full meltdown mode. Half the neighborhood's siding with you, the other half's hiding behind their blinds." I told him I hadn't done anything but read a map. He raised his bottle. "To literacy," he said. We clinked. Then came the cherry on top. Saturday morning, I was sipping coffee on the porch when a sheriff's cruiser rolled up. My first thought was that Mrs. Greaves had finally pulled the big guns. The deputy stepped out, calm and polite. "Morning, sir. We got a call about illegal excavation on your property." I nearly spit out my coffee. "Excavation?" I pointed toward the lake. "You mean that hole full of fish?" He smirked, clearly trying not to laugh. "Mind if I take a look?" We walked down to the water. The ducks greeted us like witnesses. He scanned the area, then looked at me. "Looks pretty natural to me." I handed him a copy of the deed and map. He nodded. "Yeah, this checks out. They really called 911 over a lake." I said, "They call it proactive enforcement." He chuckled, tipped his hat and said, "Good luck with your neighbors, sir." That was the moment I realized I had something stronger than anger on my side. Truth and humor. Bureaucrats can argue emotion, but they can't outlast evidence. The HOA had thrown every tool they had at me. Letters, fines, gossip, even law enforcement. And all it did was make their eventual defeat that much funnier. I decided to take it one step further. I drafted a formal letter, not angry, not sarcastic, just firm. It read, "To the Board of the Lakeside Homeowners Association, it has come to my attention that a portion of the HOA's clubhouse and adjoining dock are located within the legal boundaries of my property, as confirmed by the attached county documentation. Until this matter is resolved, please refrain from accessing or maintaining any portion of my land without permission. Regards, Thomas Hayes, property owner." I printed 3 copies, one for the HOA office, one for their attorney, and one for my records. I mailed them all certified. If there's one thing HOAs love more than power, it's paper trails. The silence that followed was almost musical. No letters for a week. No drone. No surprise inspections. Just the sound of sprinklers and distant lawnmowers. For the first time in months, I actually enjoyed the quiet again. But I knew that quiet in HOA terms doesn't mean peace. It means plotting. On day 9, I got an email, not from Mrs. Greaves this time, but from her husband, Bob. The subject line read, "Friendly discussion opportunity." I almost laughed at the phrasing. He wanted to resolve the misunderstanding amicably. I agreed to meet him on neutral ground, my dock. When he showed up, he looked like a man trying to sell a car he didn't own. "Look, Tom," he began. "We're all neighbors here. Maybe we can work something out. Avoid any complications." I leaned on the railing, staring at the lake. "What kind of complications, Bob?" He shifted his weight. "Well, maybe we could lease the area for community use. Just to keep things simple." I smiled. "You want to rent my land, so you can fine me for using it?" He didn't answer. "Tell you what," I said. "Why don't you talk to your lawyer first? I'll wait." He left looking like a man who'd swallowed a lemon. That evening, I saw him and Mrs. Greaves walking briskly toward their house, papers in hand, arguing in low voices. The next day, another emergency meeting notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board. The subject, "Boundary Dispute Resolution, Confidential." I didn't attend this one. I didn't have to. I already knew the outcome. The more they talked, the deeper the hole they dug. Meanwhile, I went about my routine, fixing the porch, cleaning the gutters, living my quiet rebellion. Every nail I hammered felt like punctuation in the world's slowest punchline. That night, as the sun went down and the water turned gold, I sat on the dock and thought about how absurd the whole thing had become. They called 911 over a lake, and in the process, they'd handed me the deed to their favorite meeting spot. I didn't know exactly how this story would end, but I could feel the tide turning. The air smelled like wet earth and victory. I took another sip of coffee and smiled. They had no idea what was coming. By the time spring rolled in, the lake had turned into the most talked-about body of water in the county. The ducks didn't seem to care, but everyone else did. Word spread faster than dandelions after the wind picks up. I'd gone from that quiet retired guy with the nice dock to the man holding the HOA hostage. I didn't correct the rumors. Why waste breath when gossip does the heavy lifting? The first real sign of panic came in the form of a letter taped to my door, marked emergency board meeting attendance required. I wasn't a member, technically, but since the HOA's clubhouse sat on my land, they were apparently inviting me to negotiate occupancy. That phrase alone made me smile. You could almost hear the panic between the lines. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday night. I arrived a few minutes early just to watch them squirm. Mrs. Greaves stood near the snack table, clutching a stack of papers like they might save her soul. She was sweating through her floral blazer, which was new. I could tell because the tag was still poking out of the collar. Her husband, Bob, hovered near the projector like an anxious bodyguard. Around 20 homeowners had shown up, some curious, others just there for the free cookies. The moment I walked in, the room went quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Mrs. Greaves gave me a smile that looked more like a dental exam. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "thank you for joining us. Let's maintain a tone of civility, shall we?" I nodded. "That's all I've been asking for since day one." She launched into a speech about community unity and mutual respect for property rights, sprinkling in buzzwords like collaboration and sustainability. as if they might change the fact that half their clubhouse sat on my lot. Then she pulled up a slide labeled potential solutions. The first option, reacquire property segment via community purchase. The second, negotiate shared use agreement. The third, in tiny letters, read, legal mediation, last resort. When she finished, I stood and said, before we discuss buying land, maybe we should establish who owns it. I held up a folder with the county's official seal and walked to the front. This, I said, is the deed. This map shows that your clubhouse, your dock, and part of your parking lot belong to me. I've confirmed it with the county and registered it with the assessor's office. You can call your lawyer, your surveyor, or your cousin at City Hall. Makes no difference. These lines don't move. A low murmur spread through the room. Someone whispered, wait, he owns the clubhouse? Mrs. Greaves cleared her throat and said, we dispute that interpretation. I looked at her and smiled. You can't dispute math, ma'am. That night's meeting turned into something between a courtroom drama and a soap opera. Bob tried to argue that historical use gave them rights. I told him trespassing doesn't get seniority points. A few board members quietly resigned mid-meeting. By the time I left, they'd scheduled yet another emergency session to review legal implications. Over the next week, the HOA message board exploded. Posts with titles like, can the HOA evict the HOA? And who owns the lake? Showed up hourly. Someone even started a poll. Team Tom or Team Board? When I checked one evening, Team Tom was winning 83% to 17%. Democracy at work for once. That's when the local news got wind of it. A reporter from Channel 8 called, saying they'd heard about a homeowner who accidentally bought the HOA. I declined an interview, but they aired a segment anyway. The clip showed drone footage of the lake, probably the HOA's own footage, overlaid with dramatic narration about a property dispute dividing a once peaceful community. The shot ended with my sign, private lake, access by permission only. They played it like a villain reveal, but I couldn't stop laughing. The next morning, my driveway looked like a parade route. Neighbors walking dogs slowed down, waved, even cheered. One guy yelled, you're a legend. Another shouted, charge them rent. It was surreal. I didn't want fame, but I'll admit it tasted better than the HOA's stale cookies. Then the tone shifted. A formal letter arrived from the HOA attorney, typed in the kind of language that tries to sound threatening but mostly reads like a thesaurus with stage fright. They accused me of unlawful interference with community operations. I read it twice, then called their lawyer directly. Ma'am, I said, your client's operations are on my property. If you'd like to operate them elsewhere, I hear the park across the street has openings. She sighed. Are you open to negotiation? I said, sure. Rent's due on the 1st. She hung up. 2 days later, the HOA held what they called a Save the Clubhouse rally. Flyers appeared on every mailbox. Protect our shared spaces from private interests. It was unintentionally hilarious. They gathered near the lake with folding chairs, clipboards, and a banner that read, this land is our land. The irony could have powered a generator. I stayed on my porch, sipping lemonade, watching the show. That's when they crossed a line. Someone, probably Bob, decided to call 911 again. A patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. The officer stepped out, looking weary. Mr. Hayes, he said, they're claiming you're blocking community access. I nodded toward the sign. Access to what? He glanced at the lake, then back at me. Your property, apparently. His smirk said everything. He turned to Mrs. Greaves, who'd marched up behind him, clipboard in hand. Ma'am, unless you've got proof this land belongs to the HOA, I suggest you step off his property. Her jaw dropped. But, he held up a hand. Ma'am, off. It was the quietest walk of shame I've ever witnessed. After that, the gossip reached fever pitch. Some said I was suing the HOA. Others said I was evicting them. My favorite rumor was that I'd bought the lake just to start a private country club. People love drama when it's not theirs. In truth, I didn't need to do anything. They were unraveling on their own. Their lawyer quit. Their treasurer resigned. The maintenance guy stopped mowing the community lawn, saying he didn't want to get caught in crossfire. By the end of the month, the HOA's emails had turned from threats to pleas. Mr. Hayes, can we discuss temporary access? Mr. Hayes, perhaps we could form a joint committee? Mr. Hayes, please respond before further escalation. I ignored the first two. The third one, though, that's where I decided to add a little punctuation to the story. At this point, I said to myself while writing the next letter, they've called 911 twice, lost their clubhouse, and still think they're in charge. I set down my pen, laughed quietly, and leaned back. That's when the idea struck me, right at the moment when irritation gives way to amusement. I turned to the camera of my mind, as if I were telling the story straight to a friend, and said, "You know, I've got to ask. Have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? The kind that writes more letters than the post office?" Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. Then, just like that, back to the story. I sent my own formal notice to the HOA that afternoon, titled Notification of Land Usage Terms. It was short, polite, and devastatingly clear. I listed the parcel numbers, the boundaries, and the new conditions for access. Written permission required. Liability waived. Rent negotiable. I CC'd the county clerk and attached the updated map for good measure. When they received it, chaos bloomed like algae in July. Mrs. Greaves called another emergency meeting, but only 6 people showed up. By the next morning, their group emails leaked, neighbors forwarding them around like gossip trading cards. One line from Bob's message made the rounds. "We may need to relocate operations entirely." Someone added the caption, translation, "We're sunk." That evening, I stood by the lake and watched the sunset turn the water bronze. The reflection shimmered under the sign that still read Private Lake. Access by permission only. Behind me, I could hear the faint sound of a lawnmower stopping mid-cut, like even the machines knew something big had shifted. The HOA had built its empire on paperwork and posturing, but in the end, it forgot to check the foundation. I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. Gravity and a few decades of county mapping had done the work for me. The war wasn't officially over yet, but you could feel it in the air. The kind of silence that comes when the other side finally runs out of words. And just when I thought it couldn't get any stranger, a letter arrived the next morning. The envelope was thinner than usual, the seal crooked, like it had been licked in defeat. Inside was a single sheet that read, "We request a meeting to discuss mutual resolution." I smiled and set it beside my coffee. "Then I got the letter," I said quietly. That changed everything again. When that final letter showed up, it felt different. It didn't smell like arrogance or sound like an order. It read like a surrender note written by someone trying to pretend it wasn't one. Mutual resolution. That was HOA language for "we're cornered." I took my time opening it, savoring the irony. After months of fines, drone photos, and emergency meetings, they were finally the ones asking for a conversation. I waited 3 days before replying. Not to be petty, though it felt good, but because I wanted to enjoy the quiet while it lasted. On the 4th day, I sent back a short email. "Happy to discuss. Please bring your property records and proof of ownership of the clubhouse parcel." I hit send, poured another cup of coffee, and smiled at the reflection of my dock in the lake. Funny how calm water can look smug when you've won something. The meeting took place that following Saturday at 10 a.m. sharp. They suggested the clubhouse, but I politely reminded them they no longer had the right to use it without permission. So we met outside under the pavilion by the parking lot. Technically my property too, but I didn't mention that part just yet. The morning was warm, the air full of that early summer hum when the world feels half asleep. Ducks drifted lazily near the reeds. If irony had a soundtrack, it would have been that peaceful. Mrs. Greaves arrived first, looking deflated, her clipboard missing for the first time in recorded history. Bob trailed behind carrying a folder, sweating through his golf shirt. A few board members followed, 3 in total, none of them meeting my eyes. When they sat down, it looked less like a committee and more like a support group for recovering control addicts. I greeted them politely, offered coffee from my thermos, and said, "All right, folks, Let's make this easy. I laid out my paperwork, the certified map, the updated deed, the correspondence with the county clerk. Everything neatly stapled and highlighted. Years of working in construction taught me that neat paperwork wins more battles than loud arguments ever could. They leafed through the pages in silence, the sound of paper louder than their pride. Finally, Mrs. Greaves cleared her throat. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "while it appears there may have been a boundary oversight, we believe it's in everyone's best interest to maintain community access. After all, the clubhouse has been a shared space for decades." I nodded slowly. "I appreciate the sentiment, but you fined me thousands of dollars for a lake that legally belongs to me, called the police on me twice, and publicly accused me of environmental violations. You'll have to forgive me if I'm not eager to reestablish shared space." She pressed her lips together, then said, "Surely there's something we can do to resolve this amicably." There was something about that word, amicably. It's the word people use right before they realize they have no leverage left. I reached into my folder and pulled out a second document. "Here's what we're going to do," I said. "The HOA will issue a written acknowledgement that the lake, clubhouse, and adjacent path are privately owned by me. You will cease all enforcement actions and remove any liens or fines you've attempted to levy. And in exchange, I'll grant you a 1-year license to hold your monthly meetings here, rent-free." The silence that followed could have been measured in miles. Bob blinked first. "Rent-free," I nodded. "For now, consider it a goodwill gesture." Mrs. Greaves shifted in her seat. "And after a year?" "After a year," I said, "we renegotiate. Maybe you move your meetings somewhere else. Maybe you start paying rent. Depends on how neighborly everyone feels by then." She looked down, fiddled with her pen, and finally said, "We'll need to discuss this with council." I smiled. "Of course. Just remember to ask them which side of the property line you'll be standing on when you do." We ended the meeting there. They packed up their papers like defeated chess players gathering their pieces after the checkmate. As they left, Mrs. Greaves turned back and said quietly, "You know, Tom, you could have just told us all this from the start." "I did," I said. "You just weren't listening." That evening, for the first time in months, my mailbox was empty. No gold seals, no threats, no urgent notices. The quiet felt earned. I sat on the dock with a cold beer, watching the sunset shimmer across the lake. A pair of ducks floated by, completely uninterested in human drama. I raised my bottle to them, to the only residents who mind their own business. Over the next few weeks, the transformation was almost comical. The HOA newsletter stopped mentioning me entirely. The fines vanished from their records, and the once mighty Lakeside Community Board began sending out humble notes about bake sales and lost cats. You could tell they were trying to rebrand from tyrants to friendly neighbors. The power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The day the county officially updated the land registry was the cherry on top. The map now showed my property line extending right through what used to be their pride and joy, the clubhouse. The clerk mailed me the confirmation notice, stamped and signed. I framed it and hung it in my living room. A conversation piece, I called it. Then came the news I didn't expect. The HOA treasurer, a sweet older man named Jim who'd mostly stayed out of the nonsense, dropped by one morning. "You'll get a kick out of this," he said, holding up the latest HOA minutes. "Greaves resigned last night." I blinked. "Really?" "Yep." Cited stress-related health concerns and irreconcilable community differences. He grinned. Translation: "She couldn't handle losing to you." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Well," I said, "I wish her a peaceful retirement." "Peaceful?" Jim chuckled. "You banned her from half the property. She's lucky she's still allowed to drive by." A week later, a new HOA president was elected. A quiet woman named Sharon who opened her first community email with, "Let's all take a deep breath and remember we're neighbors, not enforcers." The tone of the neighborhood changed overnight. No more secret photos, no more drones, no more gold-sealed threats. People started talking again, sharing gardening tips instead of complaints. Even the kids could play by the lake without someone waving a clipboard at them. One afternoon, I saw Sharon walking along the path with her dog. She waved and called out, "Nice day, huh? Best one in a while," I said. "You know," she added, "we're thinking of having the next HOA meeting at the community park instead of the clubhouse." "Smart move," I said, smiling. "The park's cheaper." Life settled back into something normal again. The lake looked like itself, calm, reflective, untouched by paperwork. Sometimes I still got a curious glance or two from newcomers who'd heard the story. One guy even asked, "So, is it true you banned the HOA?" I grinned. Let's just say they're on probation. I hadn't realized how much stress had piled up until it was gone. Every morning now felt like a small victory. I'd drink my coffee on the porch and listen to the sound of sprinklers and birds instead of my phone buzzing with another notice. Peace isn't loud. It's the absence of absurdity. One Saturday, Gary dropped by, carrying 2 fishing poles. "Mind if I borrow your lake for a while?" he asked. "Borrow?" I said. "Buddy, I charge rent now." He laughed, shook his head, and handed me a pole. We spent the afternoon catching nothing and enjoying every minute of it. The water rippled softly under the sun, and for once, it felt like the world had learned to behave. Before heading home, Gary turned and said, "You know, Tom, I think you're the first man in history to evict an HOA." I grinned. Didn't evict them, just reminded them who pays the mortgage on the ground they stand on. That night, as dusk rolled in, I took one last walk down to the lake. The air was cool, the surface glassy, reflecting the porch light like a single steady flame. On the far end of the dock, I hung a new wooden sign, hand-carved, simple, fitting. It read, "Private Lake, HOA Free Zone." As I stood there looking at it, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and nostalgia. My wife used to say, "You can't fix every fool, but you can build around them." Turns out you can also out-paperwork them. Somewhere behind me, a car drove by and honked once. Just one long, dramatic honk. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I just smiled and muttered, "They still wave when they drive by with one finger. I count that as progress." The lake rippled, the ducks laughed in their duck way, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like the world was exactly as it should be. It's been a few months since the Great Lake Scandal, as Gary calls it, finally came to a quiet end. Life has found its rhythm again, the kind of slow, steady rhythm that reminds you why you left the rat race in the first place. The mornings are still soft here. I wake up to the hiss of sprinklers and the smell of wet grass. The coffee still tastes better on the porch than anywhere else. And the lake, that once infamous patch of water, has gone back to being what it always was. Calm, steady, and just a little smug about the chaos it caused. You can tell the neighborhood has exhaled. The tension that used to hum in the air like static has faded. There are more people walking their dogs again, fewer whispers about property boundaries. Even the ducks seem to waddle around with a little more confidence, like they know they're safe from any new bylaws. It's almost peaceful, except for the occasional reminder that suburban life never really stays quiet for long. Last week, I got a flyer tucked under my door. "HOA Community Picnic? Let's reconnect," in big friendly letters. No fines, no rules, just an invitation to bring a dish and enjoy neighborly fellowship. It was signed by Sharon, the new president. I have to hand it to her. She's got a sense of humor. The picnic was scheduled for the park down the road, a safe, neutral zone where no one owns anyone else's land. I went mostly out of curiosity. When I got there, the scene was downright wholesome. Folding tables covered with red and white checkered cloths, kids chasing each other with juice boxes, and the smell of barbecue thick in the air. Sharon spotted me from across the crowd and waved me over. "Tom," she said brightly, "glad you came. We were just talking about starting a neighborhood garden." I chuckled. "As long as it doesn't need a permit, I'm all for it." She laughed. "We're keeping things simple these days. New motto. Less paperwork, more potato salad." That got a genuine laugh out of me. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, the place had learned its lesson. Gary was manning the grill, wearing an apron that said, "Kiss the cook or pay the fine." He winked when he saw me. "Look who's back among the people," he said. "No longer the villain of Lakeside Estates." I shrugged. "Every legend has to retire eventually." We sat under a tree eating ribs, watching the kids toss frisbees. The whole thing felt almost too normal. I told Gary, I almost missed the drama. He gave me that grin of his. "Don't worry, give it a month. Someone'll paint their fence the wrong shade of beige." He wasn't wrong. Suburbia runs on small conflicts. It needs them to feel alive. The key, I've learned, is knowing which ones are worth your energy and which ones you can watch like reruns. After the picnic, I walked back home through the fading light. The sun dipped low over the lake, turning it into molten gold. It hit me then how much the place had come to feel like a living thing. Stubborn, steady, reflective. In a strange way, it mirrored me. We'd both been accused of being difficult, and we'd both proved we were just misunderstood. A few weeks later, I noticed something small but telling. People had started waving again. Real waves, not the sarcastic kind. Even Bob, of all people, nodded when he drove past. I almost didn't recognize him without his clipboard. His wife, Mrs. Greaves, had moved to Florida. At least that's what I heard. "Closer to the beach," someone said. I thought that was poetic. She finally found a place with all the water she could handle, and none of it under her control. Sharon stopped by one afternoon to drop off the updated HOA handbook. It was thinner now, about the size of a church bulletin. She laughed when she handed it to me. "You'll be happy to know we cut 52 pages of unnecessary rules." 52, I said. "That's almost a miracle." "Turns out," she said, "you don't need a paragraph about mailbox heights or seasonal wreaths. People usually know how to decorate without supervision." I nodded. "Progress." She smiled. "Also, the board voted to officially recognize your property as private land. No further disputes." I pretended to look disappointed. "There goes my shot at running a toll booth." She laughed, and before leaving, she said something I won't forget. "Tom, you may not realize it, but you did everyone here a favor. You reminded us what community's actually supposed to mean." After she left, I sat out on the dock again, letting that thought sink in. Maybe she was right. Sometimes you don't teach people by lecturing. You teach them by surviving the nonsense long enough that they see how ridiculous it was. I've had neighbors stop me during evening walks, asking for advice on handling their own HOA headaches. "Tom, how'd you stay so calm?" one man asked. "I'd have lost my mind after the first fine." I told him the truth. Patience and paperwork. They panic when you stay polite. He laughed, but I could tell it stuck with him. Maybe it'll help the next time someone gets a notice about their lawn color or garbage can placement. Life feels lighter now. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from isolation, but from balance. The neighborhood gossip has shifted to safer topics, like whose tomatoes grew the biggest or whose dog learned a new trick. Every now and then, someone mentions the lake incident with a grin, as if it's part of local folklore. I don't correct them. Let the legend grow. There's a rhythm to evenings here now that feels earned. I'll sit outside with a cup of coffee or sometimes a glass of whiskey, listening to the crickets and the faint hum of sprinklers in the distance. The dock creaks gently when the wind picks up. I still keep that framed map hanging in my living room, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how absurd life can get when people forget that common sense is free. One night, Gary came over with a newspaper tucked under his arm. "You've made page 6, he said, handing it to me. There was a small article about property disputes teaching communities the value of communication. No names mentioned, but the photo showed a lake that looked suspiciously familiar. "Think they'll ever learn?" I asked. "Probably not," he said, cracking open a beer. "But at least now they know who owns the water." We sat there for a while in comfortable silence, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the lake. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, and a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, ordinary peace. The kind you don't notice until you've had to fight for it. Every so often, I think about my wife. She'd have gotten a kick out of the whole thing. She always said I had a talent for turning irritation into art. "You never yell," she used to say. You just wait until they trip over their own nonsense. She was right. That's exactly what happened here. The ducks are nesting again this year. Same spot near the reeds. There's something reassuring about that. The world moving forward no matter what humans decide to argue about. I've started feeding them in the mornings. Sometimes I'll toss a bit of bread and say, "You lot caused quite the fuss, you know?" They just quack back like they own the place. Maybe they do in their own way. The other day, I saw a moving truck pull into one of the empty houses down the lane. New family, fresh start. They waved as they unloaded boxes. I waved back and shouted, "Welcome to Lakeside Estates. Don't worry, the HOA's mostly harmless now." The husband laughed. "Mostly?" I grinned. "Long story. You'll hear it eventually. And they will. Everyone does. Around here, it's become a kind of neighborhood myth, the man who banned the HOA. People tell it at block parties, add their own details, turn me into something bigger than I am. That's fine. Every town needs a folk hero. I just happen to be one with a lake. Now and then, someone will stop by the dock and ask, "So, what's the moral of the story, Tom?" I tell them the same thing every time. You can't control the petty, I say, but you can outsmart it. You don't need to shout to win. You just have to know which line on the map is yours. That usually gets a nod and a chuckle. Then they look out over the water, maybe thinking about their own battles, their own small wars with ridiculous rules. And for a few moments, there's that quiet understanding between people who've seen the same kind of absurdity and lived to laugh about it. As the sun dips below the treeline and the light fades to that soft orange glow, I pack up my chair and head inside. The last thing I see before closing the door is the reflection of my porch light shimmering on the surface of the lake. Steady and sure. And I think to myself, not with pride but with peace. So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it. Then I switch off the light, let the night settle, and listen to the quiet I fought so hard to keep.